Evening, and welcome to another class of Torah for everyone, called Torah for non-Jews, Bnei Noach Academy, whatever we call it, just welcome, and thank you for being here. Any questions? Should you have any questions while watching the class, or if anyone's watching live, or while it's streaming at a later time, please visit us at Ask Me. Send out any of your questions. Ask me at TorahQuestions.com. Today, actually, I'm going to ask you if you can take a few of those books down and we'll read together. I want to go through some of the verses, the actual verses in the Parsha. Now, Parsha is a Hebrew word, and it sounds very similar to its English translations. Its English, I would call its English counterpart, portion. You hear the word Parsha, portion. So I call it the Torah portion. Now, it's interesting, and perhaps I pointed out in the past, but I'll go through it again. When you look in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, you see that it has some very interesting division. It's divided amongst Torah portions. Okay, we know there are a total of 53, or to be more exact, maybe 54 Torah portions, which are typically read every Sabbath. The Jewish tradition, we read another of the portions, the Torah portions. We read another one of them until we completed an entire year cycle. Okay. However, when you look in any typical Torah, anything from one that has no translation to one that has translation, whatever that translation may be, whether English, Spanish, any Latin, any translation, it's also divided up into chapters. Look on top of the page, you'll see chapter 6, right? Mm-hmm. It's divided into chapters. And the question is, what division is which? In other words, which way is the correct one? Well, the truth is that when it comes to the chapters, going by chapters and verses, it's actually more typically commonly used because it's easier to identify and to locate, kind of to pinpoint, a specific verse or verses that you're referencing to. Okay. However, there was a time even, and it was very controversial in Jewish circles, whether to avail oneself of this convenience or not. And I'll tell you why. Because it's uncertain. No one really knows for certain the source, the origin of this division. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there are some places where the division into chapters seems to literally contradict, overlap, or sometimes overtly contradict the actual division of the Parshiot, which is plural for Parsha, as they are in the Torah. Now, the Parshiot were divided by who? Moses. So obviously it's divine. Whereas the chapters, we don't know. Some even argued that the division of the chapters actually date back or originate with Christianity. So therefore they were gung-ho against it. How can you rely on this? How can you make use of it when it comes from such an unpure and unholy source? However, the common typical practice is that we do use it because it's just merely a reference, okay, almost like a neutral thing, and it's not in any way suggesting that the division of the Parshiot as we have them, that they're wrong. It's just saying this is, quote, an easier point of reference. Okay, so I'm direct this all to chapter 6, verse 9. So in this book that I'm reading from, that you have in front of you, it's page 13. Okay. Now this, if you look on the heading, it says Noach, or Noah in English. So this parsha is called Noah. Okay. Typically, the name of a parsha will be, the title of the parsha will usually be a unique word that appears in one of the first words. But it's not it's not just like that, just so ambiguous and arbitrary. Rather, on a deeper level, it actually has a connection to the general idea, to the general theme of the portion. If I had to call this by name, if I had to give this like a title, I would say the portion of the flood, right? You think of Noah, you think of the flood. There is an association, which we'll get to soon. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Why perhaps it happens to be that this portion is called Noah, almost like he's being blamed for it to a degree, correct? Right. But that's not what I want to focus on first. Let's first read inside, because there's a lot to talk about, and we may not even cover it all in one class, which is fine. Okay, there's a lot of interesting topics and many, many life lessons enhancing one's attitude towards life, towards oneself, towards, the way we treat others and talk about others, even people who are not perhaps on their best behavior. We'll find out some interesting things. So it says as follows. This is the history of Noah. So far, so good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then it says, Noah was a righteous man, flawless in his generation. Noah walked with Elohim. Elohim is God. Okay? Noah walked with God. Question. And perhaps you may not be familiar with this rule, but as you hear the rule, you'll identify with it, especially anybody who's read a little of the Bible, a little of the 5 books of the Moses.
Mm-hmm.
You'll kind of concur that, yes, it makes sense that this is perhaps one of the cardinal rules in the Torah. And you can see it even reflected in the translation, even though the translation is obviously, not even verbatim and certainly not accurately 1000%, because it's very hard to translate from one language to another, but still you see something that it's always written in a very concise manner. The rule that I'm referring to is that the Torah never says any extra words. Never says any extra words. Certainly doesn't repeat itself, and certainly doesn't state the obvious. So when something can be inferred, something is so obviously inferred, the Torah would not say it. If the Torah does say it, meaning if God shows when he dictated to Moses, to his scribe, what to write, remember, every word here is divine. He dictated these words. He told him exactly what to write. So when God, in his obvious infinite wisdom, chose to write what looks to be an extra word, that is really a clue. That is telling us something. That is giving us some insight. That is directing us to, hey, look here, there's something here. So why would the Torah repeat Noah's name? In other words, if I read the verse this way, this is the history of Noah. He was a righteous man, flawless in his generation. Who we're talking about? Noah. Why do you say again the name Noah? Okay? And why does it say he was righteous in his generation? It's like me saying, I'm alive today. If I'm alive, it's today. If I'm talking to you now, I don't have to state the obvious. I'm alive now. Mm-hmm. Hi, I'm here now. I'm here. Perhaps if I said that, that would imply somebody who just stepped into the picture, perhaps that you were maybe waiting for me and you were getting impatient, and I come and I go, I'm here now. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But if without the absence of that in the context, why am I saying now? It's obvious that I'm here now. If I'm talking to you now, I'm here now. Right. Why state the obvious? So why are we stating that Noah was a righteous person, but it wasn't his generations?
Could it mean that there were other righteous people in other generations, or more righteous people?
Okay. Again, the Torah, there is what we call the accepted interpretations, meaning these are not just interpretations that some genius, smart people just kind of thought up and came up with. Rather, that has been handed down by tradition. Because remember, the Torah is what we call the written law, but the oral law was passed along with it. Mm-hmm. So it's not like they're simultaneous. They were saying this is how we understand this. So here's a very important answer. In fact, we have what I would call the primary or most authoritative commentary on the Torah is called Rashi. Rashi is an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, meaning Rabbi Shlomo. Yitzchaki means his father's name was Isaac, Yitzchak. Solomon Yitzchaki. Now, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki lived, give or take, about 800 and something years ago in Europe. Mm-hmm. And he has the most authoritative, I say, and the most absolutely, I have to say, primary translation. Everybody relies on his translation. It appears very simple, but has a lot of depth to it. And he kind of walks us through the verses. Anything that needs explanation, he explains. Rashi So we'll just refer to him, from here on as Rashi. Rashi explains, he gives two answers on this word, quote, in his generation. And he says the sages explain it in two different ways. There's actually a debate how to understand it. Because it sounds like it's underscoring in his generations. It's implying and not in another generation.
Right.
Or perhaps is it implying even in his generation? So this is what it's saying. You see, it's saying Noah, according to one opinion, Noah, he was a tzaddik. Tzaddik means a righteous person. He was a righteous man. He stood out above the fray. But we have to take it with a little grain of salt. Just know that maybe compared to, let's say, Abraham, what we're going to learn about in the next portion, he wouldn't have stood out. So he wasn't a bad guy, but he wouldn't have, attracted that much attention, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Because in his generation, the people were so corrupt, they were so bad, that compared to them, Noah is ish tzaddik. He's a righteous man. He is just wholesome, walking with God. But it was only relative speaking. The other translation says, no, look how special Noah is. It's actually speaking even deeper and greater of his praise, of his virtue. Even in his generation, even in his times when people were so corrupt, the entire, so to speak, movement, if I may, right? The flow was going all in one direction, which was obviously a bad direction. And he was literally the only one swimming upstream, going against the flow, literally. And that takes a lot, because there's one thing, if you're a good person, you have a disposition. Some people just seem to be, we spoke about this in the past, goody goodies. They seem to be, just have a good disposition. They're not really so prone, or certainly not eager to do crime and to do what's bad. They just kind of like, lean towards doing the right thing. That's fantastic. But when you have all that peer pressure, and you have society, literally heading in the other direction, right? Like, the story with the guy, right? His wife calls him frantically on his cell phone. An older gentleman, getting a little delirious, and he didn't realize he's heading home. And she says, Joe, I hear on the news, be careful. I hear on the news that there's this crazy guy driving in the southbound lanes. He's heading north in the south. He's driving against traffic. He goes, don't listen to the news. They don't know what to talk. There's hundreds of them. To go against traffic is very scary. Yeah. Right? So what Rashi says is, Noah, the reason why the Torah repeats his name is to tell us, stop. Noah was a righteous man in his generations. Do you know how hard it was? To be good in a good society, it's great. Yeah. Can't take away any credit from you. But to be so good and righteous, to stand out and to walk with God, that everybody is corrupt, entire society. It's not like, okay, if you go to the park, people are corrupt, but if you go to the general store, people are okay. Everybody, wherever you go, there's corruption everywhere. And you to stand above all of that and to be different than everybody else and to go against the grain, now that is something unique. That's something very special. Now here I ask you the following question. And we're going to see this inside a little later, a little further in this very Torah portion. There's a rule. And here you learn another rule, how to learn the Torah, how to approach the Torah. The Torah avoids speaking negatively about anyone and even anything. So to speak, even animals, even just creatures. If it's for no good reason, let's frame these words. Let's highlight these words. If it's for no good reason, which I'll elaborate in a moment, then there is no reason to speak negatively about anything. Now, what would be a good reason? Sometimes you have to be very direct. You cannot tiptoe around something because you want to be very direct because there's a lesson to be learned or there's a clarity that needs to happen here. We need to highlight something. But in the absence of a specific need, the Torah will never speak negatively about anyone. So the question is, there were two opinions here, and both of them are true. Because remember, if one was untrue, it wouldn't be recorded as a legitimate opinion.
Right.
In other words, it's part of the Torah tradition. It's part of this tradition. Question. I understand the one that says, wow, the Torah is trying to highlight, the Torah is trying to put him on this great pedestal of how great of a righteous person he was, even, I underscore, even in his times. But that makes sense. I see why the Torah would say that. But why would the Torah point out negatively? It almost seems to be unfair. It always seems to be somewhat disgusting. You know, you don't want to give the guy credit, but immediately go, you know, he's a great guy, but talk about it later. Come on. You know what I mean? Why? What's the point? What's the value in it? Why would the Torah need to do that? How could that opinion, how can that interpretation, how can that commentary even be true? It doesn't seem consistent with the Torah's way of approaching matters. The answer is, as I told you before, when there is a reason, there's something to be learned from it. Remember I said, why is the parsha called Noah? Now it could just seem very arbitrary because it's an identifier, right? Because it says this is the history of Noah. This is the history is a very common word in the Torah. So actually, there's not the first portion that begins with those words. But the word Noah is a unique word. So if we call it Noah, it's identifiable. It's almost like, you know, it's a zip code. It's a name. It's a unique name. But remember, that's very arbitrary. That cannot be the only reason. That cannot be the ultimate reason because the Torah is a lot deeper than that. You see, Noah, as we're going to find out, was a fantastic tzaddik, a righteous person. Walk with God. That's no small thing. God speaks to him. God saves him and his family. That's it, from all of humanity. That's amazing. But Noah had a flaw, which we need to learn from. Noah had a flaw. And this is the Torah's trying to tell us. As much as you want to celebrate Noah and appreciate his greatness, but at the same time, not just to put him down, not to besmirch him, just for the sake of that. But at the same time, we need to learn from his shortcomings to make sure not to repeat it. What was his shortcomings? As we're going to find out, as we all know the story, God told him to build an ark, to construct an ark. And he went about doing it. And it took him a long time, very long time, 120 years. And we'll get to it later. There's a reason for it. What was the purpose? What was the reason why God instructed him to do that? And why would he put him through all of that? God can find so many different means to save someone. He doesn't need a certain boat, a box, an ark to save the human beings, right? If he can bring such a flood to the world that he can create the world as we've discussed in the last portion in Genesis, come on, he can find another means. You know, he can just raise them up to the, I don't know, outer space for that time and then bring it back down. Well, I don't know. I don't have to be creative for God. God can find his own way of doing things, right? Yeah. Why did he do it? Because God never punishes without giving an opportunity to repent. He never, so to speak, takes surprise revenge. There's no such thing. We see it throughout. You know, the prophets will come and want to say, guys, you know, please change your ways, or there'll be certain signs of this, you know, there's doom, there's impending doom. You know, try to reverse the bad decree, so on and so forth. God gave him this task. So people should see, imagine every day, first they see the guy planting trees. And then they say, what are you up to? You know, there's going to be a flood. Yeah, right. Look at the weather. It looks so good. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? And this went on. And then, you know, sometimes a person tells you something and it sounds like, you know, they had an interesting idea. But a week later, if you ask them and their tone changes, you know that it was just a thought. It may not be reality. But when 10 years later, he's still at it. 20 years later, he's still at it. 30 years later, he's still at it. It's supposed to leave an impression and tell people, hey, this is serious. At least this guy thinks it's serious. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So he's not looking for attention. He's not just looking for for some kind of interesting hobby or anything. It was just a hobby. He would have given it up a long time ago. This is serious. He must know something. Let me take this to heart. So the intended purpose of him building it for so many years was that when the people come and ask, what's going on here? That he tell them, you guys are behaving very badly. You guys are going to be destroyed. Not you guys, all of us. It's just that I will be saved by God because God chose to. But I'm part of you, and I'm asking you, please change your ways. That's great. Here's the problem. Noah, unfortunately, didn't go out there. He didn't go out of his, I would call his comfort zone, to go and try to change the people, to go and try to work on and impress the people. Later on, we'll encounter another very righteous person. And he is the father of monotheistic faith. He is the father. Why? Because Abraham, whatever he knew, whatever he understood, whatever he felt, he and his wife Sarah, they didn't just keep it to themselves. They spent their whole lives teaching people, trying to influence people. And they did make a change. They impacted the world forever for good. Noah, he didn't go out of his comfort zone. He was what we call in Yiddish, in European Yiddish, there is an expression, a tzaddik in pelts, which in English would translate a righteous person in a parka. You know what a parka is? Well, we don't suffer from this problem here in Florida. But when it gets really, really, really cold outside, imagine you have an image in your mind, someone living in Alaska, in Siberia, an Eskimo, parkas, those real heavy fur coats. Now, someone comes into the house in the smack of winter, and it's freezing cold. It's freezing cold. It's very uncomfortable. Certainly, you can't go to sleep. You're shivering. What do? Well, there's two ways you can go about it. One way is you go, and it's tedious, takes a lot of effort. It might even take you putting your coat on and going outside into the cold, into the wind smacking in your face, into the snow, get wet, get dirty. You can bring in a few logs of wood. You start a fire. It takes a little time. But what is the result? The whole home heats up. And after all that effort, which is an effort, everybody can be warm. Now, you, the person who came in, and anybody else that enters that home can enjoy the warmth. It's cozy, it's toasty, it's nice. But then there's another way. I'm cold. So I'm just going to take a very heavy parka and a few heavy blankets and just cover myself. My own body heat's going to keep me warm, but the rest of the house is freezing. So that's the expression, a righteous person in a parka, which means he or she is perfect, but the warmth, the aura, the holiness, it's only for themselves. It's not going anywhere. And that's what the Torah is telling us. It's not saying he was a bad guy. It's not saying he was terrible. But yet, there's something that we need to learn from and understand that that's not the proper way to do things. And that's why the Parsha, the entire portion is called Noah. Yes, in a certain sense, on a certain level, the flood, the destruction of the world, as they knew it, is attributed to him. It's Noah's flood. And that's an important lesson. Now, we live in times when it sometimes could even be dangerous, perhaps, to go out there and tell people what to do or how to do it. Some people are just crazy. So, of course, this is not saying that Noah had to endanger his life. Notice that Abraham, when he was out there feeding people and getting them to thank God and all the stories associated with it, there was a time when his life was somewhat in danger in the beginning when people had no idea. But with time, he gained momentum and people started to listen to him. In fact, as time went along, not only was he successful in the, quote, spiritual sense, in the sense of him influencing the world in a positive manner, he even became a very successful person in the literal sense, materially, a very rich man. And then later he had a son, and so on and so forth. So, of course, my point is you don't have to endanger your life, and you certainly don't have to lose all your friends and coworkers. There's a time and place to do it. You're an HR person, so something you don't want people to start bringing their opinions and especially religious opinion and political opinion to work to the workplace. That's not a place for it. But at the same time, your circle of friends, the people you know, people who may listen to you, give them a good idea, good lesson, good directive in life, a positive way of looking at things, morally, ethically, fundamentally. That is what we learn from here. Don't be like Noah. Don't be like him in the sense where, look, I'm okay, I'm good, I'm taking care of my family, and, I'm in my comfort zone, and, that's it. So that's one lesson. And the other lesson, again, which certainly pertains to our times, when it says compared to his generation, which again I said seems to give off some kind of negative connotation, right? It keeps on connotation. It's some negative connotation, as if he wasn't good enough, he wouldn't have been so great another generation. So, if you think about it, that's still positive. It sounds negative, but it still is very, very positive. And in fact, perhaps it has more positivity than the other interpretation. Because you know what it's saying? It's saying is even in your generation, even if everybody is bad, everybody's bad, everybody's terrible, everybody's wicked, everybody's totally, at a spiritual, moral, ethical destruction. Sometimes you can ask yourself, where do I get the strength? Where do I get the strength to be different than everybody? Where do I have that tenacity, that inner drive to do it? And even if I do, I may not end up being the greatest tzaddik, the greatest and most righteous person of all times. That's okay. But you be the best you can, regardless of what generation you live in, regardless of what's going on around you. So we learned two lessons here. Don't be afraid to be the best person you can, even though society doesn't agree with it. And today, certainly, we live in a time when there's just crazy winds of insanity just flying in all directions.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a wind blowing from one side, from the east, from the north. Here it's coming from all sides, every type of, craziness. And you think, sometimes you get very disheartened. And you're like, so what do I do? Do I maybe just keep quiet? Do I maybe stop being the good person I want to be and just be neutral and just kind of get through life and wait till it's all over? God forbid. No. Be the best person you can. In fact, don't hesitate from trying to positively influence others, not to dictate to others, not to put others down and saying, I'm better than you, but to show other people the beauty in being the best people that they can be. So in other words, if I may, this is in a sense a call to activism. Activism, not as we know it, an activist, people hurling Molotov cocktails at buildings or, smashing police cars. That's not activism, okay? That's vandalism, okay? That's criminalism, okay? I'm talking about being active. And active for one person doesn't necessarily mean exactly the same activity for an activeness for another person. One person, it can mean talking to their coworkers outside of work, right? Going out for people that are like-minded and you influence them. For another person, activism maybe could mean, giving lectures, giving classes. For another person, activism could be, trying to stop somebody from doing that. It comes in all different forms. But we cannot be Noah in that sense of, okay, God tells me to do it, I'll do it. If someone comes over and knocks on my door and goes, hey, what's that structure in the back of your house? Okay, I'll have no choice. So maybe reluctantly, I'll tell them, and they'll roll their eyes, and I'll roll my eyes. Like, I hope this doesn't. I hope no one knocks on my door. No, be proud of it. You know what I mean? Go out there. and really almost, I say, enjoy helping others. Look what happened when Abraham enjoyed helping others. Look what happens in his world. He brings influence. By the way, we're going to learn about it later. But recall the story with Sodom and Gomorrah. When God tells them, I am going to destroy them, there's no negotiation here. There's nothing to talk about. It's a done deal.
Yeah.
And still, Abraham, who is so the opposite of what they were and the way they behaved was the antithesis of who Abraham was. If anything, he should have said, yay. He should have been gleaning and say, finally, you're getting rid of these wicked people. And instead, what does he do? He does everything possible to try to save them, to try to give them a second chance. And God, please, you have to destroy them. Is that the only option? And he looks at you, if you recall the story, maybe there's some righteous people. Maybe we can get some merit, something going here. In the 11th hour, he sticks his foot in the door and and does whatever he can that door shouldn't shut. That is a sample. That is an example of what we should be like, when it comes to this. And that's why it's interesting. Sometimes you hear people, talk about justice. And I know we're all human beings. And we all, we get angered, we get incensed when we see, crime happening, especially senseless crimes. I mean, not no crime has sense, but, it's things that really don't. And we almost glee and enjoy seeing the perpetrators getting hurt. And that's not really the right way according to Torah. I'm not saying to you that as a human being I never felt that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But justice is something totally different. We'll talk about it when we get to that episode, to that story. But just the idea that even Abraham, who couldn't stand these people, their ways were the antithesis of who he was, and still he was looking for some justice. And justice includes not just handing down the severity, but also the kindness. It's a balance. It brings it together, right? Judgment is to judge and to bring them, and see which one prevails, or maybe a blend of the two. He wasn't saying, just let them continue doing what they want to do, but still he was looking for a way. In other words, he cared about the people of his generation, even the wicked people, even the bad people. Noah, maybe he cared, but he certainly didn't show it. He certainly didn't go out of his way to do it. And that's a lesson for us. That's something we need to really, really focus on. How to be, the person that cares about his society, and how to care about making a change, not just being good for myself, not just being good for oneself. It's another thing is very interesting when it says, I just want to finish off this verse, when it says Noah walked with Elohim, meaning in English, Noah walked with God. In Hebrew, the reading, if I was to read it and translate it literally, it says, Et ha-Elohim hithalech Noach. Hithalech Noach comes from the root word of walking. But hithalech can also imply to mean that he was kind of being walked with God.
Right.
And that too is very telling. It tells us that as great as Noah was, the difficulty of being righteous in his day and maintaining that virtue was so hard that, so to speak, God had to help him walk. It almost like God had to support him in order to make it happen. And that again teaches us something, a very positive thing. Even when you feel like, okay, my virtue, my good deeds should be mine. I want to own them. And the truth is, we do, because we once spoke about that, the virtue of why God gave us free choice. The fact that I could have chosen to do bad and yet I chose to do good, that in itself makes me the owner of my good deeds. And I own it, and I deserve the praise for it. Not that I'm doing it for the praise, but I deserve the credit for it, right? And that's why there's reward and punishment in God's world, right? But at the same time, one can say, look, I made this good choice. Okay, I made the choice to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, if I can't do it on their own, on my own because things are so tough and I need that support, maybe it's not mine. And maybe I don't own it. And maybe therefore it doesn't have the full credit. In other words, it's not a true virtue.
Yeah.
And that's what the verse is teaching us. Okay. So no, I needed a little support from God because it was that difficult. But still, what does the verse call him? A righteous man.
Mm-hmm.
Not only a righteous man, but as it says, flawless. In other words, there was no flaw in what he did. In his righteousness, there was no flaw. Even though he had to, quote, walk with God. God had to, so to speak, hold his hand. And that brings us to another thing. And that is a very important lesson. In the Talmud, it says, I'll paraphrase, that, quote, if somebody comes to purify, I mean, somebody has a true and honest, real desire to do the right thing, it says, quote, he, meaning the person, this is a neutral gender, he is helped from above. God has a special affinity for somebody who wants to do the right thing. God really helps the person who wants to do the right thing. Somebody wants to do the wrong thing, I don't know that God helps him, but God doesn't stand in your way. Make your own choices and do it. Sometimes the opportunity seems to be that it seems to be so much easier. It's not easy always to do the right thing. To make a choice, especially when you're going against the grain. You're going not only against the grain of society, sometimes against your own grain. Because your heart is, your temptation, your desires are pushing you in one direction, and you got to push back in the other direction. It can be sometimes a very fierce and difficult struggle. And that's where we need our help. That's where we need God to kind of step in and help us and hold our hand and say, don't drown in either in societal cesspool or in our own, struggle with ourselves. God says, it's okay. You're still going to be flawless. You'll get all the credit. In other words, you will have done the right thing, even if I'm there to help you. Because God doesn't come to help us unless we step in. He doesn't step in unless we sincerely make that true decision to do the right thing. So if we just show a little tenacity, just a little goodwill, then God comes in and helps us with the rest.
And that's where Abraham walked before God.
Yes.
A difference.
So that sums up, but we only went through one verse, which is good, right? But it tells us a lot. So just to summarize, what we learned today, we learned a few things. Number one, not to speak negatively about anything. And the Torah doesn't speak negatively, and we'll see more of that later in the Torah portion. However, at the same time, when there's a lesson to be learned, when there's a message that needs to come across, then you have to be very clear, very direct. And even if it involves saying something which appears negative about someone or something, then so be it. And then the main lesson is, the next two lessons is, number one, even if the people in your generation are, going in one direction, if that's the wrong way, even if you're just one person, just one family, just one small family, against hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of people, that shouldn't deter you from doing the right thing, even if you're going against the grain. And number two, when you know what the right thing is, when you have that true virtue and the sense of what's right and wrong, you can't just stand by. You can't just, allow the rest of the people to just corrupt themselves or continuously become more and more corrupted without even making an effort, taking some action, albeit in a responsible manner, not doing anything crazy, in order to try to educate the people, to try to help somewhat in some way for them to change their ways. So